On behalf of the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, thank you for being here tonight. My name is Irfan Malik. Is that better? Okay. And I'm a trustee of the ICJS, and it's my honor to welcome you to the third and final of our Confronting Islamophobia speaker series. Chris Lighton, founding director of the ICJS, is receiving an honorary doctorate degree tonight, and our current executive director, Heather Miller Rubens, is at that ceremony, so I've been asked to fill in for her. A little bit about myself. I joined the board of ICJS in 2015, and it's just to give you the background, it was again through friendship. One of the individuals I know who's in the audience today, Alan Edelman, he introduced me to the organization, and I was quite impressed with their work, given that there are many organizations that probably are focused on one faith or maybe two faiths, but this was one organization that was covering all three faiths. So that really interested me, and I've had a wonderful time serving on the board since then. Today, our work at ICJS has never been more urgent. As you well aware, we are challenged by violent and dangerous levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in America. Jewish cemeteries are being desecrated. Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim are being physically attacked and killed. Mosques are being burned. The ICJS remains vigilant in our efforts to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in our city, in our state, and in our country. Now, how does the organization like ICJS work to challenge prejudices, fear, and violence? We firmly believe that two ingredients that are necessary to building resilient interreligious networks are increased knowledge and real friendships. The Confronting Islamophobia speaker series aims to equip those willing to engage in these sometimes difficult conversations with accurate information in order to recognize and stand up against Islamophobia. Before we start the event today, I just want to acknowledge the sponsors who made this series possible. Institutional friendships and community partnerships are pivotal to a healthy city and community. It is with deep gratitude that I recognize the ACLU of Maryland, the Howard County Muslim Council, the Maryland Humanities Council, and WYPR. And now it's my distinct pleasure to invite Dr. Humaira Ziad, the ICJS Scholar of Islam, to the podium and introduce our speaker tonight.
I'm very happy to be here tonight, again, to welcome you all to the third in our series. And I'm pleased to welcome tonight Corey Saylor. Corey Saylor is the director of the Department to Monitor and Combat Islamophobia at the Council on American Islamic Relations. And he is on the front lines of research, public engagement, and alliance building to confront anti-Muslim racism. Corey has 20 years of experience in legislative advocacy, in political communication and media relations, and brings this expertise to bear on his work on confronting Islamophobia. Corey has authored a number of reports that document anti-Islam sentiment in the US. The latest, in fact, just came out yesterday, I believe. Was it? Yes? The Empowerment of Hate, the Civil Rights Implications of Islamophobic Bias in the US, 2014 to 2016, which documents that in these last 2 years, there has been a 65% increase in anti-Muslim bias incidents and a 584% increase in hate crimes against Muslims, a number that is almost impossible to believe. In earlier publications, Legislating Fear and Confronting Fear, the second one was written with UC Berkeley Center for Race and Gender, he maps and analyzes the impact of the American Islamophobia network, a core group of organizations whose sole purpose is to foment hate against Muslims in the public square in various ways. Corey is a regular voice on US and international news outlets, from Fox News to CNN and Al Jazeera, and he has also been active in combating anti-Islam legislation nationwide and raising concerns about countering violent extremism programs in the US, both of which we've addressed in earlier conversations that we've had in this series. So this is really a fitting end to the series, to have someone who is on the front lines of this work come to us today and talk to us about the Islamophobia network, the ways in which this network functions to foment fear and hatred of Muslims in the US, and then how we as individuals can step up, be vigilant, be aware, and be allies in this fight against anti-Muslim racism. So without further ado, I would love to bring Corey to the stage.
And good evening, everybody. So first and foremost, I want to thank all of our hosts this evening, and particularly the staff who worked to put this event on tonight. They deserve a round of applause if we can thank them very much. Then give yourselves a round of applause for putting up with the traffic to get here. That's huge. No, really? Come on, guys. So if you get anything from my talk tonight, this picture right here sums up everything that I'm going to say to you. And we'll come back to it shortly. But I just want you to keep that image in your mind for a little bit as we go through this conversation. And what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about what Islamophobia is very quickly, then look at some of the sources that we've identified, and then we'll talk about the US Islamophobia network a bit, because it's one of the sources that we think many people don't know too much about, its impact, its funding, and then get to my favorite part of the presentation, which is what can we all as individuals do about this phenomena of prejudice in general in our country, but my specific focus is countering Islamophobic prejudice. So first and foremost, as an advocacy group, we have to have a definition of what we're trying to deal with. And when you read the definition that I just put up on the screen for you, the one thing that I really want you to see in what we're looking at is closed-minded prejudice. So I'm not talking about people who come up to Muslims and say horrible or ask horrible questions or say horrible things, but are genuinely interested in an answer. I'm talking about people who, like the sign we have up there, figure on 9/11 they learned everything they needed to know about Islam, and that's the end of the discussion. Those are the kind of people that are really the main concern we're trying to address. Because I think people that are willing to have open and genuine conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, I really want to have that conversation with them. And I would say to you, in my career, some of the most important conversations I've engaged in have been with people who started off saying things that would be very shocking to most people in this room. But it's always interesting to see when those conversations evolve to an understanding of common ground, at least in some respect. If you know what Islamophobia is, you want to know where am I taking us with this whole conversation. And I do like to point out about the vision that we have, that when I asked a lot of experts, I talked to about 30 experts before we developed a vision, and the original vision was essentially Muslims just want to be treated equally to everybody else. We want to be the same. And I was testing that vision out in rooms full of people, and I was in a room full of 200 people. I showed the original vision to them, and I said, what do you guys think? Do you agree? And the entire room nodded their head except for one guy in the back who stood up and said, no, I don't. And I like him already because he's willing to challenge the assumptions in the room. And I asked him why not. And he said, I don't want to just be seen as equal to everybody else. I want to be seen as a net positive in society. So when people hear the word Muslim, they think honest, trustworthy, hardworking. And I think this guy is absolutely right. So we disregarded 200 people and 30 experts and went with his opinion. And that's what I'm looking for. And I don't need to tell anybody in this room that we are a very long way from that. If you do keyword studies with people and you say, what's the first thing that comes into your mind when I say Muslim? It's usually not hardworking, trustworthy. All right. So I promised you we're going to move through this quickly. And I never liked this screen, but I've never found an image that I felt is good to have there. We're going to talk about a few sources of Islamophobia in the United States. That's the first place we're going to go. And this first one I think is blatantly obvious, but needs to be addressed. The actions of violent extremist groups have a significant impact on the way Islam is viewed in this country. No shock to anybody in this room. What does, I think, get lost in that conversation is that those same groups hate us just as much as they do everybody else, right? Most of the people that die at the hands of ISIS are Muslims. My boss is on an ISIS hit list because we wrote a letter challenging ISIS's ideology and they didn't like it. So they issued a short hit list of Western Muslim leaders they want to see assassinated. He's on it, and that's why we all stay very far away from him at all points in time. But it's worth addressing that particular reality. We recognize it, but the question that we have, or the thing that we would assert, is that we're all allies in the fight against any form of extremism. And I don't think, unfortunately, our political environment always sends that message to most folks. The other thing that, again, no shock to anybody in the room, but here's the numbers just to prove it to you. Media coverage of Islam in the United States is overwhelmingly negative. This is a research company, and the green doesn't quite show in this room, which actually works to make my point for me. You see that big, huge red line there? That's the negative coverage. That little green sliver that you can barely see, that's positive coverage of Islam. So this group, Media Tenor, when they looked at coverage of Islam across thousands of different articles, found that, unfortunately, when Muslims are giving out water to people in Flint, Michigan, because the water there is toxic, that hardly gets any notice. And it has been Muslim groups that have been on the front line of doing that all along. When some crazy person in Afghanistan waves a sword and yells death to America, guaranteed repeat news cycles. So it's very, very difficult, I think, for the average person in the United States to form a balanced understanding of anything having to do with this conversation because the media coverage is overwhelmingly negative. And it's also been shown that if a Muslim commits some atrocity, they will garner tons of media coverage, not always so when it's somebody who has some other motivation behind their action. The other thing that's worth acknowledging, U.S. foreign policy, again, no shock, I don't think. We usually point to Iraq when we're talking about this point. I think everybody kind of understood after the 9/11 attacks why the United States would go into Afghanistan. I have been in D.C. for 20 years. I have not yet met somebody who could explain why we invaded Iraq after that. And I know for a fact it made us a lot of enemies. It eroded a lot of goodwill. And it is used persistently among groups that are anti-American to try to win people over to anti-American ways of thinking. Almost done with the different sources, but another one that no shock to anybody in the room, politicians exploiting fear. I don't feel like naming the elephant in the room just yet. We will talk about it eventually. But I do want to point out this study that a colleague of mine did. She's a former Gallup researcher. And in 2013, she looked at anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States. And what she found is that it tends to spike in relation to campaign cycles as opposed to news incidents. So in the 2012 election cycles that she looked at, she found there was a 10-point jump in anti-Muslim sentiment, primarily on the Republican side, during each of those election cycles. You don't usually get the same after an incident. And we can talk in a little bit about this election cycle, and while there's no numbers to back it up at this point in time other than attacks on the American Muslim community, I can tell you that her assertion seems to have played out. Oop. And let's go to the last one. This slide is just an introduction to it, but we'll talk about them in a little bit more depth in a moment. But this last source is, I think, what most people don't see operating so much. And that's why we like to talk about it a little bit more. Because I think with each of those slides I showed you up to this point in time, it's been kind of something that everybody understands as being reasonable. The actions of this network that we're about to talk about are not always as visible to most people until we start pointing things out to you. So let me first tell you a little bit about what we know. Right now in the United States, we have identified 74 different institutions that use Islamophobia or Islamophobic rhetoric on a consistent basis. At least 33 of those, when you look at the work they do and the totality of the statements that they're putting out, they are essentially full-time dedicated to making people like you, people like my neighbors, afraid of and hate Muslims. So 33 groups, that's all they do. We call them the inner core of the U.S. Islamophobia network. We'll talk about them more in a second. But I just want to quickly sort of explain to you the other group, the additional 41. The other 41, what we call the outer core, these are groups that use anti-Muslim rhetoric on a fairly frequent basis, but it's not their sole reason for existence. So what's an example of that? Fox News. You see anti-Muslim rhetoric there all the time, but that is not their sole reason for existence. As a matter of fact, I think while they contribute a lot to Islamophobia in this country in my book, they're not always given credit where it's due. So for instance, when Bobby Jindal, the Louisiana governor, was one of those people running for president, talked about we're going to ban radical Muslims from coming to this country, Megyn Kelly took him to task, essentially saying, the Constitution says government doesn't get involved in religion. By what criteria do you say the government can interpret what's a radical Muslim and what's not? And she pointed out, we have people here who do some of the same hateful things that violent extremists do, and they're led into this country. So to the outer core groups is not what they're always doing, but they're definitely contributing to it. Those 33 inner core groups, though, when you look at their finances, and most of them are nonprofit groups, which means they have to file their taxes in a place where somebody like me can go and look at it. When you look at their finances, what we found is that over a 5-year period, they had an excess of $200 million in total revenue. That we know of, right? That's just what I can pinpoint. That money was spent to make people afraid of or hate Muslims. The poster next to it, I'm sorry that one never quite shows up as well as I would like. What we were trying to do there is show folks where some of this money comes from and who it's going to. And if I can just quickly call your attention, you see the white circle at the top on your left. Right below that, the red circle, that's a picture of Donald Rumsfeld. So we know that Donald Rumsfeld's foundation was giving money to groups that are known for promoting Islamophobia. So these are not fringe groups that nobody's ever heard of the names involved in them. And let's go on and talk about their impact really quickly. So they have 33 groups, 205 million at least in total revenue. I'm sure that number's higher now. We just haven't updated our numbers since the end of 2015. This goes back to the first conversation that was had in this series, but I just wanted you to see it visually. Right now, on the books in the United States, there are 10 states that have passed laws that were intended to vilify Muslims. They have no other purpose. Constitutionally, the question always comes to mind, how do you do that? Well, how it works is, in Oklahoma in 2010, they actually passed a law, an amendment to the state constitution, that said, should judges in this state be allowed to consider foreign law or Sharia law, which is derived from the Quran or Prophet Muhammad. I mean, that's what this, I may be paraphrasing a little bit, but that's what the law said. And I can guarantee you 2 days later, we sued them for it, because that is a very clear violation of the First Amendment. And it was interesting, the wave of phone calls that I got telling me that we are traitors, we're trying to destroy America, we're subverting the Constitution, and yet 3 years later, a panel of appeals court judges in that area ruled in our favor that yes, it was in fact a violation of the First Amendment, and yes, it was in fact a violation of the Supremacy Clause. So who was upholding the Constitution, right? So what happened is the anti-Muslim groups went to the drawing board and they said, okay, we can't pass laws that directly target Islam, but we want to be able to pass legislation against Muslims. What do we do? So now what the bills say is, should judges be able to consider foreign law? And in the conversations around it, it's wink, wink, nod, nod. We all know what we're talking about. And the proof of that is when you go to the hearings, when you look at the testimony, they're not talking about the 10 Commandments, right? They are talking about Islam consistently. Those 10 laws are the result of the anti-Muslim network in the United States. You do not get bills passed without support from somewhere. We couldn't decide whose picture to put up here. And this is sort of new to the presentation. But the reality is now, we've had a problematic sea change in this country where we have now a man in the White House who is on the record expressing extreme animus toward Islam. So it's not like after 9/11 when whatever my personal disagreements with, say, the Patriot Act and other things that President Bush did, he went to a mosque right after 9/11 and reminded Americans not to turn on each other. Now we have a man who has deliberately tried to make people turn on each other. So if I'm talking about impact, that's great. We see these names. Let me talk to you about how those anti-Muslim groups are able to talk to this White House. Everybody remembers San Bernardino happens. The Trump campaign has this idea to ban Muslims from the United States. They did not just on the campaign trail one day go, let's ban Muslims from the United States. They had the idea. According to the Washington Post, they sat on it for several days and announced it in conjunction with December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, to give the policy proposal more impact. When you read the press release that went out, they cite in there a poll conducted by the Center for Security Policy, one of the foremost anti-Muslim groups in the United States. That poll, which is known to be, it does not reach the standards that the group that approves polling in this country holds such things to. So in other words, it's junk. That poll was conducted for the Center for Security Policy by Kellyanne Conway. You may notice her name on the list behind me, which means that the Center for Security Policy is talking directly to somebody in the White House. They have more ties than that, but I think that's just one of the most clear connections we can show you. Sebastian Gorka, if you haven't seen the stories about him and the way he feels about Muslims, I would suggest you read up on it. Another group that we took off of this list, though, Act for America, who is also one of the most effective anti-Muslim groups in the country. Michael Flynn was on their board of advisors before he went to the National Security Council. And they were very proud of him being there, and now they don't talk about him anymore for some reason. So we know Kellyanne Conway has worked on this poll. Here's another example. When you read Muslim Ban 1, so the first executive order that caused the complete chaos in the airports, there is language in there that the place it's used is in the anti-Muslim groups, this U.S. Islamophobia network. So when it ends up in an executive order, we know sort of who's behind it. And a friend of mine who used to work for the FBI, he used to infiltrate white supremacist groups for the FBI, was explaining to me one day that what the white supremacist groups do is you have the low-level people who say really horrible things, but also sort of work in language that is sort of code words and everybody knows what you're talking about. So in the case of Islam, preferring violent ideologies over American law. I can tell you whenever I read that where that came from. But what happens is the leaders higher up the chain don't say the really horrible things, but they will mention things like violent, or people who prefer violent ideologies over American law. And what that does is everybody knows what they're talking about. It's called a dog whistle in politics, right? So these things found their way into the executive order, which tells you that this group that I'm talking about, this U.S. Islamophobia network, has an impact. And the last thing that I want to point out, and Homaira was very kind to mention our newest report, came out on Tuesday, had done a lot of work in advance of it, getting press people to cover it. We had great coverage for 8 hours, and then Comey was fired. And that ended that. But these are, the organization I work for, CAIR, has offices across the country. We have attorneys on staff who, when somebody feels like they've been discriminated against because they're Muslim, we can provide that person services free of charge. So when somebody calls us, we have an intake process we put people through. These are all cases based on our intake process that our people on the ground have identified as having some element of religious bias. Those numbers each represent some human being who has been through some horrible episode. And I will tell you, as somebody who is in this business, you have to be somebody who's very much an idealist to get into this business in the first place. And then you have to learn to take that idealism and shove it really far down and wrap it in pragmatism. Because you hear on a daily basis stuff that really makes you sometimes just want to walk away. And so when I show you those numbers, I think, to me, the case that most upset me when I heard it was a kindergartner whose teacher was referring to him as her bad little Muslim and would not let him put his backpack down, so was forcing him to carry all of his books around all day long. So this poor little kid's back was hurting him all the time, and his teacher was calling him this name. There's a lot of horrible stuff that happens, but in my book, when it's done to kids, it's beyond outrageous. Okay, so I call that the depressing part of my speech. Has it been effective? Are we all bummed out now? Cool, glad you made that drive in traffic, right? So let's turn it around. And I'll go through this bit. It'll take us maybe 10, 15 minutes at the most, and then we'll open it up for questions, which is my favorite part of any one of these conversations. And don't worry about my hosts. Whatever question you have in your mind, ask. You can't be rude to me, trust me. So I'm here to have a very frank conversation if people want to have it. But if prejudice in this country is something that upsets you and you feel a need to do something about it, here's some suggestions for you. First and foremost, I would prefer if you as an individual find a group that you like. I will be mildly biased and say CAIR is a good organization to be with. I will also point out the ACLU, because they're also a great group here in Maryland and here in the room tonight, and one of the sponsors of the event, so I have to be super nice to them. Find a group that you like, sign up for their email lists, and when they ask you to do something, act on it. It usually doesn't take more than 5 minutes, but the amazing thing is it takes your interest in doing something and makes it part of a movement that's doing something. And I can tell you, as somebody who has launched campaigns against corporations, there was one time more than a decade ago, Burger King did something that was problematic for us. I called up a CEO, one of the senior management over there, and I said, this is the concern we have with what you guys did. And he was like, thanks. And I said, what do you think you're going to do about it? And he's like, I think you know, and hung up on me, right? So I put out an action alert, and what I understand is that we flooded their servers with emails so that we were shutting them down. Their receptionists couldn't work anymore. And then I got a much nicer phone call from somebody higher up in the hierarchy. Mr. Saylor, we'd really like to talk to you about this. That did not happen because of me. That happened because people like you took 5 minutes out of their day. right? So if you ever think that joining with one of these groups maybe doesn't do anything, I promise you, it's one of the most incredible things you can do. So join up with a group that works on things that you like. So I said CAIR, Amnesty, the ACLU, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, any one of a number of them. The next thing I want you to do is learn from mistakes that have been made in the past, and that's where we get to this slide. So right after 9/11, what you saw on TV was a lot of Muslims going out and saying, Islam means peace. And then you had a lot of very confused looking people because Islam means peace is not what the media is showing me. The media is showing me crazy guy in cave in Afghanistan saying death to America, right? And what we've come to understand, and maybe some of you in the room know more about it than we do, but there are within the brain structures that lead to prejudice. One of the things that we all suffer from, me included, is known as confirmation bias. You tend to look for information that reinforces what you think already. So if you consider yourself a progressive, you probably, when you turn on MSNBC, find yourself nodding your head a lot, right? Oh, that's absolutely right. If you flip over to Fox News, you will find yourself very angry quite quickly. Flip that backwards, if you consider yourself a conservative, Fox News tends to be saying a lot of what you appreciate. And MSNBC will equally drive you crazy. What goes along with that is that people are looking for you. If I'm saying to you Islam means peace and that doesn't jive with what you think, you are more likely to reject what I'm saying. I'm not confirming what you think. So what I'm doing actually is creating a problem for myself. And if you give me an hour and a half, I can probably get around that problem. But since I'm in quick communications where Bill O'Reilly yells at me and I get 9 seconds to yell back, well, not him anymore, but somebody like him, we have to understand that if we just say something like Islam is peace, it's not going to work for us. There's also very simply mental shortcuts that we have to overcome. And as a Muslim activist, I have to recognize that most people in this country were introduced to Islam on 9/11 watching airplanes hit buildings. A very, very emotional, painful experience for all of us. But then you have to think about the brain, and what the brain does is, if I'm walking down the savannah and a lion attacks me, the next time I see a lion, I'm not going to stop and go, I wonder what its motivations are. My brain is going to go, last time it went after me, now I'm more in fight or flight mode. And the same thing happens. When you have such a painful, difficult introduction to anything, that is not going to go away anytime soon. So as activists, we have to recognize these are the things that are going on in many people's minds. So how do you get around it? A few basic tips for you. First and foremost, use the familiar. This is one of my favorite stories, other than the picture I showed you earlier, and which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. 2006, the first Muslim in the United States was elected to U.S. Congress. His name is Keith Ellison. He's from Minnesota. He won. He's kind of doing his thing, the same thing all politicians do after they win an election, you know. Good for us. You know, we worked together as a team and we won this seat. And some journalist asked him, do you think you'll take your oath of office on the Quran? And he's essentially like, sure, why not? I mean, it was like an aside almost. But that became a firestorm. As members of Congress said, you know, we can't have people taking their oath of office on the Quran because if we do, immigration will take over our country and flood it and there won't be any America anymore. And Keith kind of reasonably responded, well, my family's not immigrants. We were brought over on slave ships a while back, but we've been here for a long time. And that really didn't cut through the noise, in all honesty. The oath of office, according to the Constitution, you do not swear it on any book. You raise your right hand and there's some words that you recite. And then afterward, you go and you sit with, in this case, Speaker Pelosi when she was Speaker, And you do the ceremonial oath of office. And that's where you use the family Bible or whatever it is that you feel is the appropriate expression for you. What Ellison did, called up the U.S. Archives, asked them if he could use Thomas Jefferson's Quran. And that's what you see him taking his oath on there. Use the familiar. Now you're not arguing with the Quran anymore. You have people arguing with Thomas Jefferson, who is an icon in American history. And you can argue, without a doubt, the man owes slaves. Without a doubt, the man is an icon in American history. And very, very difficult for most Americans to criticize. So now, you guys want to criticize Thomas Jefferson? Go for it. But this is the familiar, right? People understand that. For me, this lesson came in most powerfully when I was doing an interview about jihad, and I knew the interviewer was going to be kind of hostile to me. It was a taped interview, which means, it wasn't going out live. We were going to do it, they were going to use it later. And when they put our earpieces in and we're sitting and we're doing the interview, and we get to the moment and he goes, "Mr. Saylor, explain jihad to me." And I just looked at him and I said, "It's my right to defend my life, liberty, and the way I choose to pursue happiness." And he sat there for a moment, and his mouth kind of opened up a little bit. And the moment went on long enough that the producer said, "Break, let's do that again." So we did. We did it again, and the next time he had, an immediate comeback to me. But I had used something that he understood intrinsically, the familiar. So when you're talking to people about prejudice, if you're saying to them terms and things that are distant to them, it's hard sometimes for them to understand. I'm not talking about deceiving anybody. I'm not talking about lying to them. I'm talking about explaining to people using things that we all get and understand. Humor. With the caveat, if you're good at humor, great. If you're not good at humor, please, dear God, the universe thanks you not to do it. In this case, we were at a meeting with a bunch of people from Sweden. The Swedish Muslims said they had come up with this fake medicine. They called it Islamophobia. They went to one of the anti-Muslim politicians in Sweden on camera and were like, "We think you're sick. Here's some medicine for your problem." And we were like, "That's great. Can we steal it?" And they very kindly let us do that. So we created our own fake medicine, Islamophobia. Take some and call a Muslim in the morning. The video that we did for it, the term viral is cliche, so I hate to use it, but I knew we had a hit on our hands when one of my daughters came to me and said people in her school were sharing it. So I was kind of like, yes, victory with the kids. We must have done okay. But it injects some humor into the conversation. So we were up at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, hand and nose out, and when you're laughing, it's easier to have a conversation. And this is another example of it. This is, I think, one of the most stereotyped covers I've ever seen to a magazine. Every stereotype about a Muslim possible, except for a fully covered woman, is in that picture. And Newsweek started a conversation online on Twitter using the hashtag Muslim Rage. And what I loved is a bunch of Muslims started responding and adding their own twist to it. And this next one is my absolute favorite. But you see the effect. When you're laughing, you're not laughing at these people. You're laughing with them. We all understand each other as human beings. It's not, I'm saying something to you that don't understand. It's we share a desire to laugh. And we share that common humanity. And it opens up conversations. So when you're talking to people, it can feel like a moment to get really, really serious sometimes because it does get heavy. If you can interject a joke in there, it's insanely helpful. Now we come to my picture. There was a mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. They had been there for a decade, and they decided they wanted to expand their facility. And as soon as they filed for that, like a firestorm swept over them. Their construction site, there was arson there was graffiti there were shots fired, at the construction site, and then they were sued and taken to court. And in court, the people suing them argued that Islam is not a religion and therefore does not deserve protection of the First Amendment. The federal government wrote a friend of the court brief, what's called an amicus brief, pointing out that yes, actually Islam is a religion, which is really appreciated that the federal government would acknowledge that, and really insane that they had to. And eventually they were allowed, I think it was 3 years, they got the expansion approved. And then this is the part where I go, God bless them, because after all of that, they decided they needed a cemetery too. So the whole cycle started all over again. This picture, they were taken to court again. This picture was taken from the court hearing. And I used to shave my head last year, so I have gotten questions if that's me. It's not. The young lady in the picture is a student journalist. She went to the hearing to cover it. The gentleman giving her the death stare was there with the anti-Muslim crowd. If you have a chance to watch the video she's shooting right there online, it is a really well-executed death stare. It is one of the best you will ever see. What I find fascinating about this picture, though, is if I were standing in that young lady's shoes and somebody came up to me like that, my reaction would be something along the lines of, get away from me, back up. It would be an angry response. What she does is she stands her ground and smiles at the guy, right? So when you look at that photo, you tell me who you feel sympathy for. I don't know if you guys have seen some of the videos coming out lately. Guy on the beach screaming at a Muslim family. You tell me, how a normal human being reacts to that. So, as I said, if you learn anything tonight, that's how you deal with prejudice right there. You look it in the eye and smile. That doesn't mean you back down. That doesn't mean you don't disagree with them and have an argument with them if necessary. But you do it in a respectful fashion. And you may not win over the person you're arguing with. I will tell you, most of the time, I don't win them over. But the people watching us, the neutral observers, I will very often be able to win them over. And what I found to add to this, so being unapologetically yourself is very important, because we have a lot of people, like particularly a lot of women right now, are very nervous and want to take, and we see a number of women taking off their headscarves. And if that's what they choose to do, that's absolutely their right. But I also believe that if they choose to wear it, that's their right too, and that they shouldn't be afraid to walk around and do that. If you have guys who grew up in other countries where wearing the long thobe, the long white shirt that you see many Muslims wearing, is what's comfortable to them, in America, you do not have to wear jeans, right? I believe it should be their right to choose, so be unapologetically yourself. But when you engage in those conversations, I already said use humor, use the familiar. What we also find is when I try to talk facts and figures with people, I lose. Not in the sense that I'm losing the argument, but they don't stop screaming at me. So I share an office with somebody, and I've seen her just breaking out into laughter because we experiment sometimes when we get these calls. So they'll call us and they'll start raging on us and saying horrible things, and I'll engage them. And if I try to say, well, Muslims believe this or that, I lose it. If I talk about ideals, well, look, I'm an American too. I very much believe in America. Here's how I've defended the Constitution. Here's my ideals, my humanity. Then I tend to win people over. So keep that also in mind. Be unapologetically yourself. Be willing to talk about ideals. And then the last point that I want to make before we open it up for conversation, showing grace is also extremely important. So we've said stand up to people, be willing to hold your ground and smile. But again, what we had in this incident, a mosque in Texas was partially burned down by arson. And so they put something up on Facebook saying, we need help rebuilding. Can people send us money? So somebody who doesn't understand the use of humor responded, I'd be glad to send you some Bibles and bacon sandwiches. Me, again, being the flawed human being that I am, I probably would have written something harsh back. It's like, dude, this isn't funny. Somebody just tried to burn our center down. Them being the smarter people that they are, they responded, that's great. We can always use more knowledge, the Bibles, and we can give the sandwiches out to the homeless in our area. And you tell me who won that argument among the neutral observers, right? So it's a recognition, it's unfair, but true. Somebody comes up and starts yelling at you, that human response is to show it back, right? We, as people who want to see prejudice gone in this country, have to recognize it's unfair, but we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We have to show and live and be the example of our ideals. We can't just say Islam is peace. We have to show it. We have to show it in a way that is so solid that those neutral observers see our side of things, and that the people who are going to hate us no matter what really have no ground to stand on, because they're always looking for us to slip and give them some reason to reinforce what they believe already, right? So we can do a whole evening on that, but I want to leave it there because you guys sat in traffic and would love to give you all the opportunity to have a conversation.
Corey, how did you get involved in this project?
All right, there goes the next 40 minutes of our evening. I will shorten it down. First of all, I met a girl when I was in high school. She's from Afghanistan. And we got married when we were 19, and I became Muslim as part of that. So I don't never ever try to put myself on a high horse. It wasn't some burning bush moment or some high holy angels. I fell in love 100%. I also at that time had been going through drug issues, and being with her got me away from all of that. So one thing that you never hear about the converts who got cleaned up, right? You always hear about the very few people who went down a worse path. And I initially got involved because I wanted to give back to this community that embraced me after I had been really doing some ugly stuff. And I appreciated the opportunity to get away from that ugly stuff. After 9/11, and this is, again, remember, I'm a human being. After 9/11, I think I figured out that I just simply don't like prejudice, and I like giving prejudiced people headaches. So that, in truth, is part of my motivation. I get to go to work, and I get to uphold the ideals that I was taught in middle school, that you judge everybody in this country or any human being on individual merit, not based on race, religion, ethnicity, whatever. I love being able to do that every day. But I will tell you, we talked about the anti-Islam legislation. When that stuff started coming out, my motivation for being involved in this evolved a little bit more. And that is, I truly believe that there are some folks who would strip constitutional protections away from Muslims out of fear. And given the history of this country, if we as Muslims stand silently and allow that to happen, we're not always going to be the ones in the spotlight. It's going to be somebody else at some point in time. And if we don't do something to stand up against it, we have not upheld the gifts that were given to us by the African American community, the Jewish community, the Catholic community, Japanese Americans who were put in internment camps. These rights have been won through a long struggle, and we have a role now to play in it. So every day I go to work because I believe that the rights that are laid out, particularly in the Bill of Rights, are phenomenal, and everybody should enjoy them. And while I work primarily in the Muslim sphere, I recognize that me protecting them today makes sure that they stay in place for everybody. And I will say, some of our best allies are particularly the Jewish and the Catholic communities, because those communities recognize that from their history, some of the things that have been done to them, at least in terms of faith, if it's done to us, the cycle can always come back around. So thank you. I thought it was a great question too, thanks.
There's been a lot of publicity recently suggesting that the Trump administration wants to extend greater protections to religious organizations' participation in the religious sphere. I think it's obvious that the Trump administration thinks that they're helping the Protestant evangelical community with these initiatives, but do you think these initiatives will be helpful to your organization as well?
we have 2 points to make on that. First and foremost, I do believe that everybody has the absolute right to be religious as they want to in this country. I also believe that that religion can motivate you to do better things for your country and to serve your government, but religion should be kept out of government. I think it's something to be argued in the private sector. So when we saw that the Trump administration is instructing the IRS to sort of look the other way when religious entities start endorsing candidates, I think we find that puts us on a road that I'm uncomfortable with, based on Benjamin Franklin's old statement. Benjamin Franklin once said that democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for dinner. Democracy under a constitutional republic is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. So as somebody that represents a minority, I recognize when you give the overwhelming majority of some country the opportunity to vote certain ways, even thinking they're doing the best thing, that can sometimes erode freedoms. That's why we have the Bill of Rights to protect, to say there are certain things in this country that are completely off the table. So I'm concerned that that's the direction the Trump administration is taking us in. The second point to make there is that in many ways the genesis of that executive order comes from the state level Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. The one that was passed back in the 90s by the federal government, or sorry, the 1990s, was a well-intentioned thing trying to make it easier for people to have places of worship. These more recent ones, I would argue to you, are a thinly veiled attempt to give people of certain backgrounds room to discriminate against LGBT folks. And within that also exists, if I don't like your lifestyle as an LGBT person, I don't like your lifestyle as a Muslim. So while that wasn't in this executive order, which we expected it to be, we remain very, very cautious, keeping our eyes open for that kind of thing to develop.
One thing that I've noticed is that some family and friends, like tending to be liberal family and friends, that still had Islamophobia, anti-immigration sentiment, because since the Trump inauguration, and before that running, that actually people have become more supportive of Muslims or immigrants because it's like counter to all the rhetoric. So I'm wondering, besides all these statistics about the increase of Islamophobia and actions against people, whether there are statistics and information about that actually there is also an increase of people responding negatively to all of that rhetoric.
Thank you, that's a great question. Where's the executive director of the Maryland ACLU? There we go, all right. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I understand it correctly, in the wake of the election, the National ACLU made quadruple its annual budget in 2 days. Was that the statistic? She's laughing, maybe Maryland didn't do as well.
I don't remember by how much, but a lot of money did flow in response to the fact that we brought a case immediately that weekend of the ban, the Muslim
against the Muslim ban. Yep.
Yeah. Our director, Anthony Romero, always reminds us that we have 300 attorneys, including all the affiliate attorneys and all the attorneys in the national office and the government. The Department of Justice alone has probably quadruple or more.
Truth.
So,
but I point that out because right after the election, 2 things happened. One, there was just a wave of prejudice incidents. We tracked 111 in the first week after the election, just targeting the Muslim community. You saw the targeting of the Jewish community and other groups. At the same time, though, people were donating in droves to groups that are dedicated toward protecting the rights of different minorities in this country. And that was, I truly admit to you, that was amazing to me, because it was very easy for that week or so after the election to feel really lonely as this wave of calls came in. But it didn't really happen because at the same time, you had tremendous outpouring of not just verbal support, but people taking action. And then the next thing that I saw happen, I already alluded to my wife being from Afghanistan. So my wife was 10 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So she is a refugee, a war refugee. And I had been married to her for about 15 years before she told me about a day where she and some of her friends went out and threw rocks at the Russian soldiers. And they had a very large machine gun pointed at them for doing that. And her family fled and came to this country. And right after the election, she's saying to me, it feels like back home. And to me, what she's saying is it feels like the communists, right? I mean, this is Cold War stuff, just arrived. And to hear that about my country was very troubling, and her country now, obviously. And remembering that she came here at a time when the Afghan Mujahideen were considered the front line of our war against communism, and now the same, the Afghans are quite vilified. So all this money is coming in, and then the Women's March happened. And I brought her up because we took one of our daughters to the Women's March, and I saw on their faces, given that statement from my wife, I saw on their faces hope and a sense of ease for the first time in a while. And that's the other thing that happened. You have this thing now called rage donating. I don't know if you've heard about it, but people will be watching the news. They'll see President Trump say something, and they'll donate to some group. It's pretty awesome. But you also have this movement that came up and said, this individual does not represent what we think America is about, and really energized the civil rights movement. And it now remains to be seen how it's going to play out. But I will point out that Trump said he was going to ban Muslims from the country, put out the executive order. Rudy Giuliani, one of his advisors, goes on TV and says, they came to me and said, how do we do this thing, the Muslim ban, legally? Right? So we know there's anti-Muslim animists. They're going to try to do it. And then not only do you get great lawsuits from like the ACLU, Washington State. So this is government people stepping in too. So I think it's unfair to only look at the negative, and that's why your question is so great. There is this positive thing that is going on as well. And I am very excited to see that energy turn into a movement. And I think it's going to continue giving the Trump administration headaches every time they try to cross the legal lines and mess with people's constitutional rights.
Hi, thank you so much. So you've talked about these groups that exist basically exclusively to construct a certain narrative about Islam. And they've raised this enormous amount of money, and they have this grossly disproportionate media presence. And it seems that because of the logic of the media with its spectacle and its negativity and everything, that the Islamophobia industries are sort of inherently this very viable economic machine. It's generating itself, it's reproducing itself. People love to watch it, obviously, like so many people. And I'm curious as to how you think these attempts to counter those narratives, which are numerous and, as you just said, are increasingly attracting money and everything. But how can our efforts begin to match this real virality, this vicious virality of the Islamophobia efforts?
I often assert to folks, and speaking for the Muslim community here, that in many ways, most Muslim organizations that you see operating today, particularly in the political sphere, were founded in the 1990s. So as a community, we were in our political infancy when 9/11 happened. And we're very much on the defensive for many years after that. That's not the case anymore. And everybody's grown up some, and for instance, these same Muslim groups, I don't think you can argue that they just focus on Muslim issues anymore. They've become true civil rights organizations that serve the broader community. So not only is it, we've been around for a bit longer now, but we have a lot more allies. To the media piece in particular, that being around for a while has brought a little more understanding and sophistication. So let me give you a very specific example. One of the people that's very well known in the anti-Muslim network is a woman named Pamela Geller. If you don't know her by name, you know her by her work. So a few years ago in New York, there was a proposal on the front page of the New York Times about an idea to build an Islamic cultural center in Lower Manhattan. That newspaper article, people are already starting to nod, so that newspaper article attracted zero attention whatsoever. A few months later, the people behind that project, which at the time was known as the Cordoba House, had a hearing at the city council, and Pamela Geller rebranded the project the Ground Zero Mosque, and we had the 2010 Summer of Unlove, where people were screaming at us, and it became a campaign issue. So Geller, in my opinion, I may completely and totally disagree with her viewpoints on everything, but you have to respect the fact that she understands how the media works, right? If it bleeds, it leads. So when you get something nasty like that, that's going to make more media attention than, you know, some event like this, right? So what she did shortly after the Ground Zero Mosque thing is she put together ads that are really hard, that say horrible things about Muslims. For instance, Islamic Jew hatred that's in the Quran is one of them, which is not true, but it is one of the stereotypes that exists. And then slaps them on the side of public transportation, buses and things like that. In Washington, D.C., the first time she did one of these ad buys, it was 4 total ads, which, if anybody in this room does marketing for a living, 4 total ads is nothing. Nobody's going to notice in among all the noise of advertising in a public transportation system. So why do that? And that's because what she does is she does the ad, a journalist will call the local Muslim community, hey, Pamela Geller put up this ad about you guys, it's really horrible, what do you think? The Muslim community guy goes, or lady goes, that's really terrible, I can't believe somebody would say that about us, it's awful and ugly. If it bleeds, it leads, there's a fight. That's going to make the news. Pamela Geller takes that article, puts it out on the internet, see the impact that our ads are having, give me money, gets more money, and then goes and buys more ads. And the cycle continues, right? So she understands how the media works. So what we advise Muslims to do now is when the ads show up and the journalist calls, the response is, well, it's her First Amendment right to do that, which is true. And I consider myself a strong supporter of the First Amendment. You can lie and say ugly stuff. Welcome to America, right? But, so what's the journalist's headline now? Pamela Geller and Muslims agree. Editor, I'm not publishing that, right? So we figure out how to not have her conversation. We then later, for instance, have the local city council pass a resolution about tolerance in our city, which will get some coverage, or we figure some other way to have the conversation, but in a way we've chosen. So, yes, what you saw about the media can be very discouraging, but understanding now what the media is looking for and figuring out how to give them stories that help reverse the narrative that's been put forward and show the reality. We don't want to deny that there's violent extremists, but the fact of the matter is, the person, anybody in the room like Chobani? Yeah? Boy, I finally got a reaction out of the room. Excellent. Chobani. Did you know a Muslim owns it? See, you guys are killing my punchline now. Did you know that he gave a whole lot of money to his employees? Right, so you guys are, thank you, one of the more well-educated rooms that I've talked to in a long time. Most people don't know that. It totally kills my point, but that's okay. Those are the kind of stories we want to get out. We want more people to see. The Sears Tower in Chicago, designed by a Muslim. There's all kinds of things like that are worth knowing. People forget Muhammad Ali might have been a Muslim. But we understand now how that works, and we want to make sure that what we're giving to the media, we're not asking them to slant their stories, but we want them to give coverage to things that help show a full picture of what Islam looks like in the United States. And that means that eventually the violent extremism part of it will be as minimal as humanly possible. And let's face it, in my book, that is the best thing you can do to terrorists. They want attention. If you deny it to them, it's the end of their story, right? Thank you for that question. Anybody else?
You've got a family, you've got kids. How do they handle it? How do you handle telling them the facts? There are bullies in the playground, and when they get to be teenagers, forget family ties.
I've never tried to shield my daughters from this. My wife grew up in a war zone, so I mean, she's pretty tough to start with. What I make sure happens, though, is that they have always grown up hearing me say things like, yes, there's prejudice directed at us right now. It's our job to be bigger than it. It's our job to overcome it. It's our job to not be controlled by it. And they do pretty amazing at that, in all honesty, particularly my daughters. They now teach me about things. And I will tell you, I grew up in the 80s. There are some things that we used as slang in the 80s that I now understand are not acceptable because I have daughters that I have taught what prejudice means. So I, too, have learned and grown from them. But I will point out that I also, I mean, you may have noticed that I use my family experience a lot because they also remind me of what the best things in America are. And so, for instance, I was at, my older daughter is in marching band, which blows my mind because, like, I have no music ability whatsoever, and she is fantastic at it. So we go to football games every Friday night, which I never did in high school. I'm not a football person even slightly. And I'm sitting one Friday night looking at my cell phone, and I'm getting all this hate from, there was a couple of people who had nothing better to do on a Friday night, so they're emailing me all these really remarkably foul things. And I'm looking at it, and I looked over at this football game, and I wanted to take a picture of it and send it back to the guy and go, it's Friday night, I'm at a football game. That's the most American thing possible. You're at home sending me hate mail. But I decided not to because you don't want to give away where you are. Photos nowadays, unfortunately, will tell people information, and too often people decide to follow up on that information. But I would say that they are very knowledgeable, and because I haven't shielded them from it, they end up giving me things that I can then come and bring to rooms like this, in all honesty. So they are part of my network of figuring out how best to deal with prejudice.
Confronting fear you have on the board. I wonder whether the fear is more a fear of violence, and that Islam is associated in the minds of most Americans with violence. And I wonder how much of that is exacerbated by the fact that one rarely hears about any of the Muslim countries criticizing the violence that is often done in the name of Muslim. Those of us who read about this know that the Sunnis and the Shiites hate each other. The thing they like to do more than anything is to kill each other. But it's all associated with violence, and there's no central body in Islam that can do something to get rid of that that aspect of violence that most Americans now associate with Islam. How do you deal with that problem?
So as we showed in the presentation, it's about what gets focused on. So how many people know what's going on in, say, the Central African Republic at this point? with Christian and Muslim militias doing really terrible things to each other. South Sudan, Christian militias. The Rohingya Muslims have Buddhists having people going after them. Those things don't make it into the narrative. So there is no, unfortunately, sort of bright, glowing answer to the problem you pose. It's one of those things where we truly are going to have to just keep working for years and years and years to break through it. I'm very confident that eventually we'll be able to, because I've seen other communities do so. But let me give you a few examples of things that have been done. 2006, I got a phone call from a member of Congress, or at least one of his staffers. One of their constituents, who was a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor, had been kidnapped in Iraq, and her kidnappers said 72 hours or we're release these prisoners or we're going to kill her. And the congressional office asked us to issue a statement calling for her release. Instead, that night, 2 of us got on a plane, went to Iraq, and made that appeal from Iraq. The hikers in 2010, do you remember the folks that were held by the Iranians? Our executive director was on it, and head of our board of directors joined the Bishop of Washington and one of the heads of the National Cathedral in a delegation, the only delegation that was allowed to go to Iran to appeal for their release. Those kind of things happen a lot. Like the letter I mentioned earlier that was written to ISIS by a bunch of Muslim groups that got my boss on ISIS's hit list. Here's the interesting thing that happens, and this is why I'm saying there's no burning, but I'm going to keep doing those things. It's the right thing to do, right? There was a Fox News anchor who was on her show and said, I never hear Muslims condemning terror, kind of like what you're saying right now. Any Muslim who wants to come on my show to condemn terrorism can come on my show. So what do you think we did? We called our producers and said, we do it all the time. Happy to come on your show and talk about how we do it all the time and the consequences it's gotten for us. They hemmed and hawed and told us they didn't really mean a national Muslim leader, they meant a local leader. And like 5 days later, same anchor went back on and said, nobody's taken me up on my offer. So we went through all the press releases we've issued condemning terrorism, which was more than 100 at this point, predating 9/11. There were things before 9/11. And we put it into a video, like here's more than 100 condemnations and actions we've taken. Here's our press conferences. Here's all the @foxnews.com email addresses on our journalist list. There were more than 70. Here's Fox News cameras at our press conferences where we're condemning terrorism. So where are the condemnations and why don't you see them? They're in the journalists' email boxes, because they're definitely getting sent. That leaves me with my dilemma that you talked about. I will keep doing that because that's what I will keep condemning these guys because that's what my faith tells me to do. If I don't get public acknowledgement for it.
You individually are doing it.
Right.
To do the Muslim governments. They are too.
So here's what I hear that. And I don't speak for Muslim governments. Keep that in mind. And I'm quite critical of some Muslim governments. But remember, who right now is dying fighting ISIS? Representatives of Muslim governments, right? In many of these places, that's the story you never hear. The people fighting alongside our troops in Afghanistan are Muslims. And if I were given the opportunity, and I do when I can, I would call out the media and say, why are you not covering those folks more? If you're going to cover the occasional crazy guy who turns on our troops, let's talk about the guys who were coming to our country, who had translated for our troops, came here and were turned back because of the Muslim ban. And there were a number of them, and they hardly got any coverage. I mean, enough so that those of us that pay attention to the news saw it. So those things are happening as much as I would like, no, but welcome to, that's one of my criticisms. But it is happening, it just doesn't make it to our ears. And that's something where I think we need to call our media more also to account. So thank you for that. And as soon as the Muslim governments give me the right to speak to them in a very loud voice, I will make that point to them again and again, because they need to do it more.
I could easily drop into despair, easily, for any number of things, not just what we're here talking about. That said, I do believe that it's a choice, and when we ask about, what can we do? I believe one person at a time with another one person at a time. It doesn't have to be the things that are shown on TV that are not shown on TV, the good stuff, like you're saying, but just one person and one person. Just the fact that we are all here together tonight, number one. Number two, I have a friend who, during the presidential campaign, when the Muslim ban prospect was first raised, I called him and said, your family, who knows, God forbid, where this is going to go, your family is welcomed safe haven in our home. God forbid if something happens and you need that. Vice versa, with all the anti-Semitic things that have been going on. My granddaughter, I take her to a program at a JCC in Owings Mills, and that was one of many places that was targeted. He called me and offered support. And so, it's one-on-one. Tomorrow evening, I do this. I really, really, truly believe that if we but break bread together, I'm not saying that's going to fix everything, but I've been doing this for about a year, having people who I am different from them come to my home on Friday nights. And I've mentioned this here before, so if some of us are repeat people, you remember it. I just call it breaking bread together.
I'm always down for dinner.
Yeah, exactly. I always get lots of people saying, I'll be there.
But the thing that I hear in what you're saying, first of all, I want to fall into despair, but instead I'm taking action. That is the way you beat despair is do something. And that's greatly appreciated. The other thing in what you were saying that I think a lot of people don't hear enough is that when the Jewish cemeteries were vandalized and you saw the Muslim community raising money for that, that was the first time something like that ever really got a lot of attention. But those kind of interfaith things have been going on for a long time. So I cannot think of the number of times that we've had our staff go out when a synagogue or somewhere was vandalized or attacked to be part of the condemning of that and trying to help repair things. So I think those kind of things need more attention. I know as people of every faith that I talk to, everybody's taught you have to be humble about the positive things you do. In this day and age, don't be so humble about it, folks, right? I'm not asking you to go out and go like, some people that we know that I'm great. That's not what we're looking for, but it's, look, I had people over to my house. I'd like for you to do something like that because other people are feeling the same kind of emotions that you have, and hearing that helps them out. The next thing that I would ask you to do is don't always just ask your friend. Find somebody who you might disagree with a little bit, bring them in on it too. That's one of the biggest things we ever suggest to people, particularly in mosques. Find another religious community that's your friend, and find another religious community that maybe you have some tensions with. I think all of us believe that we're supposed to be helping our local communities out and doing good things. Everybody go and do Habitat for Humanity. Something like that. Because you're not sitting around saying, I believe this and you believe that. You're hammering nails in, you hit your thumb. I cuss the same way as everybody else does. We see each other as human beings, and then we all go eat dinner together. And it's a lot harder to dislike people after you've been through that experience. So thank you, ma'am.
I'm a Catholic priest, pastor of a church here in Baltimore. And about a year and a half ago, myself and my church council, feeling very upset about some of the things you're talking about tonight, the prejudice and the bigotry against the Muslim community, we announced in our church that we had to figure out a way to get connected to the Muslim community. So we did with a mosque on the east side of town. And now every other Monday, 3 of the women from that mosque come with 3 women of our church and 3 women from the Presbyterian church across the street, and they have a Quran Bible sharing. And on Inauguration Day, that was a Friday, January the 20th, I called up the leaders of the mosque and said, how about if I come to your prayer service this afternoon, 1 o'clock? They said, we'd love to have you. So on Inauguration Day, when everything else was going on outside of the mosque, outside of the world, I went and held prayer with the Muslim community at 1 o'clock on the afternoon. I didn't understand all the prayer, but I was there with them, and they were there with me. I took my shoes off, shared as close as I could, as much as they would let me, and they were so grateful that I was a part of that. The other thing I just want to tell you is that we have a Catholic school on our property, and we took the principal of our Catholic school to a mosque on the west side of town and met the principal of that school. We decided to get our kids to do something. We didn't know what to do. So the kids and the 6th graders of both schools became pen pals to each other. 2 weeks ago, we brought some of those kids together in our church meeting, and a young girl from the mosque and a young girl from a Catholic school had a conversation something like this. I was so nervous and I was afraid to call her and to write to her. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what she was like. Guess what? She likes basketball. She likes soccer. And so do I. So common, like you just said, coming that common ground of life takes apart the fears that you have about that and allows you to find another relationship way of living. So we've tried some of that in our church, and it's really been helpful, and a brand new aspect of our church life. It's really been good for us.
Great. Thank you very much. I can't add anything to what he said. As a matter of fact, I feel like I should just get back in my car and go back to D.C. and let you guys take the floor.
African Americans have a different history of discrimination and oppression than Muslims of Middle Eastern origin or lighter skin tone. What can you tell us about the connections and relationships between African American Muslims and other Muslims, if this can categorize it?
African American Muslims have, they suffer from driving while black, flying while Muslim at the same time. They also bring with them the experience of the civil rights movement. And the wisdom from that they're able to give to the larger American Muslim community is amazing. What I notice is that when I first converted, back in the 90s, you tended to have the Afghan mosque, the Egyptian mosque, the African American mosque. And that to some degree still exists, but a lot more and more the community is becoming a lot more integrated with itself. And that leads to very interesting things. One of my favorite things that I see is you have somebody from Afghanistan, somebody from Egypt, somebody who was born here, standing next to each other in the mosque, trying to figure out which Islam has less culture infused in it. So you get these very interesting discussions because, well, the Islam that I learned here was this, the Islam I learned was this, what do the authentic sources teach? And I think eventually those conversations are going to lead to a really interesting renaissance in Islam in this country. What's going to emerge from here where you've had every culture that has Islam in it interacting with each other in one place. The African American community is, well, African American Muslims make up about a third of the overall American Muslim community. Many of them are associated with the Ministry of War Din Muhammad. So you had the Nation of Islam, it split when its original founder passed away. You had Louis Farrakhan, who kept one group on the path that was the original Nation of Islam. You had War Din Muhammad bring another group into more mainstream Islam. And I think you'll find that that community is constantly coming to the newer communities in this country, the immigrant communities, and saying, look, we understand how things work here. We understand what to do when the government literally is expressing hatred towards you, as what many immigrants are seeing right now. And I think what that's led to is that right after the election, you saw a lot of people from newer communities just really, really afraid. I was in a room in Iowa. God, I had to think about it for a second. And it was mostly immigrant, and no matter what I said, I could not get a smile in this room. These people just really wanted reassurance. And you have the African American Muslim experience where people can say, look, we've been through this. even when the government is expressing outright dislike of you, there are things you can do that result in the entire nation moving in a better direction. So I think that's what that community is offering and has been teaching to the broader Muslim community for years.
Does CAIR have any outreach to students, especially secondary school students? I'm thinking that there's so much here that's related to teaching them critical thinking and perhaps helping them to learn these things before they're as old as some of us in the room.
We do. Keep in mind, our primary purpose is to fight discrimination. And in many ways, what that makes us is a firefighting organization. So we have attorneys across the country. If somebody feels like they've been discriminated against because they're Muslim, they can call us. We provide them services free of charge. So that's our primary function. But all of our chapters do outreach of the type you're talking about. And one of the things that I particularly love about that kind of work that we do is our Muslim Youth Leadership Summits that are not always just for Muslim youth. You know, we're trying to teach everybody. And let's face it, I'm trying to find the future people who can take my job so I can spend more time with my kids. So I have a strong motivation to find energetic young people. So we'll bring them in for trainings. Mostly what we do at this point in time is teach them know your rights, teach them leadership skills, teach them interviewing skills. One of my favorite things to do is to take a couple of days and spend it with young folks, teach them how to do media interviews, because on day one, you know, they all think they know what they're doing until you make them stand up and pretend to do an interview, and then everybody stumbles. The next day, they're telling you what you're doing wrong. It's a wonderful thing to see. And it helps me, you know, you talk about that impulse toward despair sometimes, to see how incredibly intelligent these folks are and recognize that while I may be holding the line right now, these are the folks that are just really going to expand and make sure. Remember, I was talking about how important it is to me that protection be, we make sure that the Constitution be protected for everybody. These are the folks that are really going to do it, in my book. So we have those programs, but I will say that one of our goals at this point is to expand them, because we are, as I said, primarily a firefighting organization. We have to deal with the discrimination that's coming in. We're working to put more and more resources into programs that will hopefully create an America where one day we don't have to do the firefighting anymore.
Friends, I'm sorry, but we've run out of time. Thank you. I want to thank Corey Saylor for coming tonight.